if you have some type of special gift of insight, it's impossible for any other human being to recreate with absolute accuracy any facts that happened, especially when you're putting these together with little bits of information here and there. The fact that the gun that allegedly shot Lester Burnham belonged to Colonel Fitz is, of course, highly relevant. However, we will show that there were no fingerprints on the gun, not even Colonel Fitz's fingerprints, and he owned the gun. Of course, this brings you to speculate about what the killer did. Probably wore gloves, probably was taking precautions against being identified. This wouldn't relate just to Colonel Fitz, but to anyone who had planned to murder another person. We'll also show that other people had access to the gun case in which this gun was locked. In fact, shortly before the day of Mr. Burnham's shooting, Colonel Fitz's son had accessed his gun case. He seemed to know where the key. He did know where the key was. He showed Janie Burnham some of the contents of his father's collections. His father had an extensive collection of military memorabilia. So there were at least two people there who knew where the key to the Fitz gun case was. That is Janie Burnham and Colonel Fitz's son. Arguably, in fact not arguably, we will show that Mrs. Fitz was also aware of where her husband kept the key to the gun case. Those are important pieces of evidence. The murder weapon, which has been identified, which no one has put into the hands of Colonel Fitz. No one has put that gun in the hands of anyone. There is blood evidence, yes. But there was there were traces of blood found on practically everyone that was in that house. After the shooting, which of course made a great noise in the house, everyone in that house was in and out of the kitchen, and blood was spattered everywhere. There was blood found on some of Colonel Fitz's clothing, but as we will see, he also came over to the house later to find out what was going on. So not only Colonel Fitz had blood on his clothing, but Mrs. Burnham, Janie Burnham's friend, and Colonel Fitz's son. There was blood evidence on their clothing, on their shoes. So, as we can see, there were many circumstances that raise a grave doubt in the minds of a person who is going to be looking at all of the facts about this case. The prosecutor is going to try to recreate, and has in front of you in his opening statement, tried to recreate what happened that night. But as we will show, the Fitz home was just a few steps from the Burnham residence. Anyone that was in that house could have accessed the kitchen just as easily as Colonel Fitz, walking a few steps through the kitchen door and into the kitchen. It could have been one of the adolescents who were upstairs. It could have been Janie Burnham's friend who was in the living room, could have easily accessed the kitchen just as easily as Colonel Fitz. I'd like to reiterate that the burden of the prosecution is to show beyond a reasonable doubt that a person has committed a crime. And when we're speaking of such heinous acts, the shooting of a man in cold blood, the burden is no higher, but it's certainly makes your responsibility even more serious as a juror. To decide whether the circumstantial evidence that the prosecution has put together rises to the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. I do not believe that the prosecution is going to be able to collect all the evidence and tell you a story that is going to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that Colonel Fitz is the person who shot Lester Burnham in the back of the head on that evening. There were too many other facts. There were too many false leads. There are too many pieces of evidence that go nowhere or that lead to multiple paths, not just down the path towards Mr. Fitz's home. I believe that we will show just what I've explained to you about the pieces of evidence that the prosecution is going to present. That they are all circumstantial, that they lead many places, but not just to Colonel Fitz. I believe that we will show that there is no motive strong enough in the mind of that the prosecution can show to motivate Colonel Fitz to commit this act. There is there is no evidence that anyone can present of any kind of conflict between Colonel Fitz and Lester Burnham. In fact, their relationship was cordial. The only possible motive that the prosecution has mentioned is that Colonel Fitz apparently found out that Lester Burnham was one of his son's drug customers. That, in fact, Lester Burnham had been buying drugs, illicit drugs, from his son, and that for some reason this might have angered Colonel Fitz to the extent that he would go over and shoot the man. This is highly improbable. In fact, Colonel Fitz's son was selling drugs to many people in the town, many people in the community, not just to Lester Burnham. There was no reason that a man as logical and as sane and as methodical as Colonel Fitz is would have taken it into his head to blame Lester Burnham. Of all the other people that his son sold drugs to, for creating the problem that Colonel Fitz's son was having. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I believe we are going to tell this story in a way that will lead you to realize that there is not enough evidence in this case that will be presented by the prosecution that will allow a jury, a reasonable trier of fact, to incarcerate Colonel Fitz, a Marine Corps veteran, a man who has never been charged with any type of crime, much less something of this seriousness, and that you will in the end up exonerating Colonel Fitz. Thank you.